In my area of Tennessee, religion, race, and perspectives on women's health all seem to come from a more conservative or right-wing viewpoint. But current legislation like the Divisive Concepts Bill or anti-CRT bill, these bills keep students sheltered, they keep them in a bubble, and they keep them from empathizing with marginalized groups in the country. My name is Matthew Hawn, and I'm a social studies teacher and a baseball coach in Northeast Tennessee who was dismissed on May the 5th, 2021 for discussing white privilege and racial equity in a high school contemporary issues class. Sullivan County is in the Appalachian Mountains, and I've lived here my entire life. I even graduated from a school in the district where I taught. Growing up, I was always interested in politics. I would even get up in the mornings before school and watch Rush Limbaugh. I was very conservative. I was also homophobic, racist, and misogynist. I believed that it was the man's job to go out and work and provide for the family, and the woman should stay at home and raise the kids and keep the house in order. But then I went to college at Tennessee Tech, and that's about an hour east of Nashville, and that gave me the opportunity to meet people with backgrounds that were much different from mine. I mean, my first friend at Tennessee Tech was black. The people I hung out with in the dorms were a very diverse group. There were public and private school kids from Nashville and kids from places I'd never even heard of, people from all walks of life. It's around this time I start to realize that maybe we're not all that different. I go through school still kind of struggling with how I look at the world, and I start taking history classes. Tennessee Tech did a very good job of introducing me to other viewpoints. I'll never forget, I was taking a class that we called the History of History. I can't remember the actual name of the course, but I remember my professor saying, whenever we read history, we are reading it from the perspective of whomever's writing it. And this was in 2002, and he brought up Osama bin Laden. And he said, if you are looking at Osama bin Laden from the lens of America, he's a terrorist who orchestrated the events of 9/11. But if you are reading about or looking at Osama bin Laden from the perspective of the Taliban, well, then he's a freedom fighter. And I was like, okay, I can understand that. And then he mentioned the Black Panthers and said, if you think about the Black Panthers, and this was true for my history class in high school, they were classified as the militant wing of the civil rights movement. But he said, do you think the people that they were giving healthcare, education, and clothing to would classify them as militant? And I'll never forget that. Something just went off in my head like, oh my goodness, there's a lot I still need to be educated on. I think part of why I became so passionate about teaching, particularly racial equity in my contemporary issues class, is I think I'm teaching to that 17-year-old kid, Matt Hawn. Because the kids in Sullivan County today are just like I was for the most part. They still have the perspective of living in an all-white culture. In college, I'd always thought about teaching, but it wasn't until after I graduated with my degree in finance that I decided to go back and get my degree in secondary education and history. It's very hard to get a job in social studies and coaching in Sullivan County because those people tend to stay in those jobs for a while, but I was lucky. I got a job at Sullivan Central High School in the fall of 2005, and I taught there for 16 years. I taught strictly economics for the first few years, but was given other classes later on, like personal finance and world history. I even got to teach a class called The History of Rock and Roll, and that was really cool. And then around 2010, about 13 years ago, the administration assigned a contemporary issues class to me. That class had state standards that I have to follow, but it doesn't have a set state curriculum. I develop the curriculum and I choose the projects and assignments the students work on. When I first started teaching that class, it was difficult, just trying to facilitate conversations between students on very hot button issues. And it took me a while as a teacher to figure out how to do that because we don't often ask students what they think about real world issues in the classroom. Teachers must adhere to a set curriculum that typically wouldn't include it. But I would tell my students, look, Unfortunately, you all are teenagers and people won't typically ask your thoughts and opinions about real world issues. But congratulations, you're in a contemporary issues class, and that's exactly what we're going to do in here. And we talked about everything from nuclear proliferation, terrorism abroad and at home. We talked about North Korea. We talked about the Me Too movement and racial equity and racial justice. We even talked about COVID and everything surrounding it, and it was a really, really good class for students to engage in and learn how to talk and listen to one another. I never had any issues teaching that class until 2020. Now, by the 2020-2021 school year, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I never had any disciplinary issues as a teacher regarding lesson plans, or anything else for that matter. But like teachers nationwide, I had to adjust how I taught during COVID. I had to learn how to talk to students through a computer while I stared at 25 avatars, not knowing whether they were paying attention. I didn't even know who I was speaking with. That school year, Sullivan County started off completely virtual. Then we came back on an A and B day type schedule, where on A days, some of our students were in the classroom, and then some of our students were at home, and B days, we were vice versa. You know, some of the topics in contemporary issues, these conversations need to be had in person, where students can openly ask questions and not be afraid to delve into the material and really feel free to state or how or what they think about a particular issue. Now, in September of 2020, I was on my way to school listening to the radio, and they were broadcasting or they were replaying the Jacob Blake family press conference. In late August, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back and side by Kenosha, Wisconsin police officers during a domestic disturbance call. During the ensuing protests, a 17-year-old kid by the name of Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 people, killed 2 of them, and then he turned himself into the police peacefully. And I thought, well, I have to talk about this today. And at the time, we were recording our lessons, so if a student had issues while they were at home, they could watch it later on my Google Classroom site. So we began that class by watching the Blake family press conference, and then we talked about what Kyle Rittenhouse did. I made the statement that white privilege is a fact, and that this is a prime example of it. A black man is shot in the back 7 times by the police, and then a white teenager kills 2 people and walks to the police with a weapon and is not met with return of force. Now, whenever I teach a lesson, I typically don't say this is a fact. I mean, I want my students to make up their own minds. It's their choice to what they believe. My job is to just facilitate the information and allow them to do the research to figure out the claim, and in this case, it would be whether or not white privilege is a fact. So we went on with class that day, and at the end of the day, I posted that contemporary issues class recording to a personal finance class on accident. And then a parent saw it and complained and asked, why was Coach Hawn talking about this in personal finance? And that's a great question because white privilege is not a part of my personal finance curriculum. But what they really had a problem with was the statement I made that white privilege is a fact. And then that led to them calling the central office. And these were people that I know who they are, and they know of me because it's a small community. I mean, we all graduated from the same high school. But instead of coming to me about it, they went to my administrator, they went to the school board, and they went to the central office. That led our director of curriculum instruction at the central office sending me a letter saying, statements like this is a fact don't lead to discussion between students and it takes away their research capabilities. He also quoted part of the Tennessee Teacher Code of Ethics that says, teachers shall not reasonably deny students access to varying viewpoints. And I said, I completely understand that. I'll make the change in my teaching. But shortly thereafter, we went back to being completely virtual. And I stopped talking about racial equity and justice because that was a year-long class, and I really hoped we would resume in-person instruction soon. But we stayed virtual the rest of the fall semester in 2020, and then we opened virtually in the spring of 2021. And you know what? A group of people tried to overthrow the United States government on January the 6th. And I wasn't really sure how to discuss that with my students. I mean, I didn't have a lesson plan for domestic insurrection. And I also live in an area where 75% of the population voted for Donald Trump. At the time, there were claims that he led that insurrection, but I wanted to be very sure before I proceeded because, we were still trying to figure out everything that happened on that day. I did want to wait until we got more information and news stories before I even began to create some kind of lesson plan that would allow the students to research what happened on that day. One of my standards is to look at historical events and how they affect the present. And I thought, well, we'll look at the 2016 election as a historical event because, it was historic. Social media was used for the first time as a major platform for a candidate. It was the first time a candidate without any prior public service won an election. I thought we could look at what happened in 2016 and see how or if that election led to the insurrection on January the 6th. So I asked my students, why was Donald Trump elected? And they gave a lot of great answers. They said, Russian interference. They said, he's not a politician. He says what he means. He's a good businessman. They said the Clinton campaign failed to schedule stops in swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio. They said all of these things, and I said, yes, absolutely, we will research all of those. But here's a perspective that you typically don't hear in Northeast Tennessee. Now, my county is 95% white. My school system is 98% white. Every student I attended school with from kindergarten to my senior year was white, and every teacher too. And so to me, a varying viewpoint for my students would be the article by Ta-Nehisi Coates entitled "The First White President." So I signed that the Friday before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and then the students were going to return to school physically on that following Tuesday. I believe this would be a good starting point for the unit and the lesson plan. Now, I'm a type 1 diabetic, and we weren't real sure when teachers were going to get vaccinated in Tennessee, so I had to teach from home. I was projected onto a TV from a computer because my doctor didn't want me in the classroom with 20 to 30 unvaccinated kids. I got my first vaccine on February the 3rd, and then my second vaccine a month later, and then 2 weeks after that, on March 18th, I was able to return to the classroom. Unfortunately, though, I never got to teach from the article because a parent complained that it was inappropriate for high school students, and I wasn't giving my students access to varying points of view. The county would eventually make the claim that this was the only material that I was going to give for my students to look at, which could not be further from the truth. I talked with my principal about the lesson plan, and I explained exactly what I was going to do. But then 2 weeks later, on February the 3rd, I was given an official reprimand by my central office. And that was completely unexpected. The reprimand stated that moving forward, they wanted a balance to everything we did in class. So if I gave a liberal perspective like Ta-Nehisi Coates, I had to follow that up with a conservative perspective. But the problem with that is I didn't take the Coates perspective as being liberal. I just saw it as the perspective of Ta-Nehisi Coates and the way he looks at race in the United States and its relationship to the 2016 election. I didn't look at it as liberal or conservative. Because in the article, he talks about Bernie Sanders. He talks about Hillary Clinton. He doles it out on both sides, no matter the person's political affiliation. No one from the central office had contacted me about what I was planning to do with the material. So I got my TEA Uniserv rep involved, and I decided to contest the reprimand in front of the Sullivan County School Board in March of 2021 at a public school board hearing. My argument was simple. It was that the central office didn't provide me with due process. And I ended up losing 6-0. They voted in favor of the superintendent of schools and said he had every right to reprimand me without speaking to me and without an investigation. And I said, you know what? That's completely fine. I wasn't happy about that, but I knew I would be coming back to the classroom in a couple weeks and I could get back to a normal school year. Fast forward to mid-April, and the Chauvin trial is happening for the police officer who murdered George Floyd by kneeling on his back and neck for over 9 minutes. At that same time, we were doing a lesson plan about racial equity and justice. We talked about things like implicit bias, defunding the police, and mass incarceration, and a lot of other things. We watched the Chauvin trial live in my classroom, and during a discussion about the trial, a student brought up white privilege. Now, before that, I decided not to talk about white privilege. I wasn't going to bring that into the conversation just out of, I guess, respect for my administrator who asked me to stay away from hot button issues. See, our school would be closing, and this would be my last semester at Sullivan Central. We would be consolidating with 2 other high schools, and then he asked that we go out peacefully, and I said, I can do that, absolutely. But when the student mentioned that, it was like teacher mode just kicked in. So I said, well, what is that? What is white privilege? And I realized, students signed up for this class to learn about things like this, no matter what the outside circumstances are. They deserve the full experience of this class. I wouldn't have hesitated to ask that question or bring up white privilege a year ago, so why am I hesitating now? It is cheating the students out of an education. And so we started talking about white privilege, and we read Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and then we discussed it. In 2020, I was sitting on my back porch playing with my dog. I was scrolling through Facebook, and I came across this poem by Kyla Janae Lacey entitled White Privilege. I watched it, and I was completely mesmerized by this vulnerable, smart, and strong woman performing this very powerful piece of art, and I thought, oh my God, I have to show this to my contemporary issues class.
People thinking that Africa is one nation. It is the waving of the Confederate flag like you didn't lose the battle and then telling us to get over slavery. It is people saying that black people destroyed neighborhoods but forgetting that white people have destroyed continents. It is every time I bring up my plight, some white man has to tell me that I'm crazy but is kind enough to praise my English or say that we're all given the same opportunities, even though he has a family history of wealth and I don't even know my family history at all. Is the justification of police brutality. Like, what did that person do? I'm sure it doesn't hurt as much when the victim doesn't look like you.
So after reading Peggy McIntosh, I showed Kyla's poem to my contemporary issues class in mid-April of 2021. There are some curse words in the poem, 6 to be exact. Less than 0.5% of the words are expletives. However, someone complained about the video, and then 1 week later, on April the 27th, I was called into a meeting at the central office with the director of schools and other members of the central office staff. They wanted to know why I showed this poem to an upper-level social studies class after being reprimanded for inappropriate materials and denying access to various viewpoints previously. Then, a week later, I was called back into our central office on May the 5th, and the director of schools handed me dismissal papers. I was dismissed from my job. May the 5th was also the same day the Tennessee General Assembly passed its own divisive concepts bill. The governor would sign that into law later that summer. But to have those things happen on the same day, it's just kind of hard to ignore this political climate that, I'm going to be honest with you, I inadvertently walked into. First of all, I never thought I would be in this situation. I still wake up sometimes and wonder, how in the world did I get here? I think it's because, my identity has changed. I used to be Matt Hawn, the school teacher, the coach at Sullivan Central High School. And now when people ask me what I do, I say, I used to be a teacher, but I was dismissed for, and so I guess that's my identity now, and that's tough to accept. I wasn't even aware of this culture war against critical race theory. I still live in this East Tennessee bubble too, and my classroom was a place where I felt like I had the freedom to discuss any issue at any time that I wanted. Because for the last 10 years, I had complete autonomy of what we talked about in my classroom. So the idea that I would be dismissed for assigning a Ta-Nehisi Coates article or using a poem by Kyla Janae Lacey entitled White Privilege as materials for my students to engage with, that thought never crossed my mind. I was fired on May the 5th, 2021, and now we're coming up on 2 years, and I'm in the 3rd step of this appeals process. I appealed the May 5th dismissal, and we had an appellate hearing in August of 2021, and that lasted for 3 days. I received that hearing officer's decision in October of 21, and he sided with the superintendent and said he was justified in dismissing me. And so I appealed that decision back to the school board in December of 2021, and they upheld the hearing officer's ruling that yes, Matt Hawn should be dismissed. Now, a year and a half later, I'm waiting on a chance to plead my case in Sullivan County Chancery Court, but I have no idea when that's going to happen. I mean, I really hope it's going to be soon. Yeah, my colleagues have been very supportive, but silent. I mean, they're afraid. Teachers and librarians all across the state are afraid for their jobs. You know, when I had my appeal in December at the school board, I was told more than 300 people showed up to support me. Now, I'm very close friends with a number of teachers from my district and surrounding districts, but the only teacher who showed up from Sullivan County, at least that I saw, was our union president. And whenever I asked my friends if they were coming, they'd say, "No, we're sorry, we can't. We don't want to be punished for supporting you." But as frustrating as that was to hear, and I wanted to say, well, you know I would be there for you. They had to weigh their own circumstances against this. I mean, for anybody, it'd be difficult to go without a paycheck for 3 months or 6 months, or even indefinitely. And going through something like what I've endured isn't easy. I don't want any teacher to have to experience what I've gone through fighting for my job for the last 2.5 years. It's an uncertain future. And so it's hard for me to be that upset with them. But, you know, they've sent words of encouragement. They just haven't been very public about it. But I mean, I have received support from many people living in many different places. I had 16 years worth of former students who spoke out on my behalf on social media, and they showed up in numbers to my appeal in December. And anytime a journalist calls and they want to speak to any of my students, I have a Rolodex full of names that I can call and ask them, and they're like, yes, absolutely, I will be there for you. 2 years ago, my sister started a GoFundMe, and people have been very generous in their donations, and that's what I'm living off of. I pay all of my living expenses and 100% of my health insurance premiums with the money from the GoFundMe. Now, I do have a summer job. I do get to coach t-ball and baseball for 5 or 6 weeks in the summer. And other than that, you know, I've done some small speaking engagements and people have paid me an honorarium. But other than that, I'm living without a paycheck. I mean, I guess I could teach in another system in Tennessee, but you can look up the license for any public school teacher in a database at our state website. And if you look up the name Matt Hawn, it says license under review. And that's because when this is all over, I'll be called in front of a licensure review board, and they can decide to strip me of my license for another 6 months, a year, or even indefinitely. But as difficult as all this has been, had I not lost my job, I wouldn't be friends with Kyla. She's the poet whose poem I showed. She's like my sister. We talk and we text almost every day. I mean, I still wish I had my job, but having her as a friend, I mean, it'd be hard for me to look back on all this as a complete and total loss simply for the friendship with Kyla. And I tell her all the time, I can't imagine a life where I didn't know you. And that's the thing with trauma. It can present other opportunities.
Why do you think the discussions of white privilege or ta-nehisi coats were such hot-button issues?
Well, I believe there are a few reasons for the pushback and the culture war we see today. First of all, this isn't from our students. Our students want to have these conversations. However, there's a small, vocal, and well-funded group of parents and community members who are leading this culture war that we see in schools today. And also, after the racial reckoning of 2020, we start to see things like the 1619 Project introduced into academic settings. We started to include voices that have been left out of American history for 400 years. Voices like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Hannah Nicole Jones and Kyla Janae Lacey. You know, that system has worked very well for white males like me, and now it's perceived to be under attack. And I don't know if this is ignorance or willful ignorance, but we didn't learn about these things growing up here. In middle school, I was taught the lost cause fallacy. And that's a myth started by Southern historians, ex-Confederates, and their children after the war to redefine the narrative of the Civil War as an act of Northern aggression. We were taught that slavery was a positive good, and it was hypocritical of Northern states to condemn slavery when the working conditions in Northern factories were so egregious. We were also taught that the North won the war because of superior manpower and resources, and that Southern military officers were superior in every way, but they couldn't overcome the Northern advantages. We were also taught that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Acts in the 60s ended racism. Then I think COVID really played a part. Parents were saying, for the first time, we are getting to look into the classrooms. And so they hear a teacher like me say that white privilege is a fact, but they really don't understand how learning happens or how lesson plans work. We educate students much differently now than in years past. I mean, how we learn is still a relatively new science. You know, for the longest times, we thought students were just blank slates that we fill with information. But we're starting to move away from that and give them the opportunity to research things. We are creating more student-centered lesson plans. And I think it's a combination of all these things. It's a perfect storm of these things happening simultaneously. But part of me wants to be slightly optimistic about all this and say there's pushback because we are introducing a more diverse group of voices into the classrooms. But current legislation like the Divisive Concepts Bill or anti-CRT bill, they deprive kids of a real and true education right now. This legislation denies students a more research-focused education. These bills keep students sheltered, they keep them in a bubble, and they keep them from empathizing with marginalized groups in the country. In the 2021-2022 school year, Sullivan County cut contemporary issues from their class offerings. I mean, you can't even take that class in Sullivan County high schools right now. I don't even know how you could teach a contemporary issues class under the divisive concepts legislation. I mean, I would say that it's impossible. Having students understand varying viewpoints is literally the definition of education. It's a challenge to what we previously thought. Get them to think about what they believe and why they believe it. You know, if I were teaching in an area like Portland, Oregon, where environmentalism is more prominent, I might give them the perspective of a Southwest Virginia coal miner whose job isn't around anymore because their economy was 100% tied to the coal industry. And then in recent years, a pharmaceutical company comes along and it injects OxyContin into this community specifically for that reason. The people there are despondent, and mining is also a manual, labor-intensive occupation. If we're starting to move towards clean energy, how do you take care of this group of people whose livelihood has been taken away from them? That's a perspective that I would bring to that classroom. In my area of Tennessee, religion, race, and perspectives on women's health all seem to come from a more conservative or right-wing viewpoint. I also think we need some kind of safety net in place for teachers so they can fight these disciplinary measures resulting from the culture war. And not just financially, I'm talking emotionally and spiritually, and do things like teach them how to talk to the media. The appeals process for dismissed tenured teachers in Tennessee, it favors the school system. The school system appoints and pays for an impartial hearing officer to oversee the first step in the appeals process. The next step is an appeal of the hearing officer's decision back to the school board. School boards are elected officials and they have one employee, the director of schools, who dismissed the teacher. It would be very hard to justify to voters why you hired someone and then voted to overturn a decision they made. The third step is in a local chancery court, and the lawyers are going to go in there and they're going to argue the tenure law. It has to be an obnoxious violation of unprofessionalism or insubordination, in my case. And then when all this is over, I will go in front of the licensure review board and my lawyer, Jenny McCoy from the TEA, will represent me. I thought this entire process would last 18 months. And then here we are 2 years later and there's no end in sight to this. Being in that first hearing was very difficult. It was very hard because basically what Sullivan County is saying, we don't trust you to teach our students. That's something I never thought I would ever have been questioned about. And then to have them throw back every mistake I made. And I've delivered some doozies of lesson failures. But to have them throw all that at you at once in a very public setting, it's tough on a person. It was tough to sit there and have them ask me during my testimony at my August hearing, well, why did you do this? And did you not think about this? And it really started to make me question, should I have been fired? Because their whole case is you did all of these things wrong. We don't trust you to teach our kids anymore. I walked out of there and I felt really defeated and beat up. And in reality, I probably did make some mistakes, just like I do in everyday lessons. But that's why we reflect and change as teachers. I don't think I've ever delivered a perfect lesson yet. But to not even be given the opportunity to change or even given a chance for some professional development, like, listen, if you're going to teach about racial equity and racial justice, we're going to send you to this professional development so you can become better at it. I would love to do something like that because I'm doing all this on my own.
Is this a First Amendment issue?
Well, the way they've handled First Amendment issues with teachers is by a case called Garcetti. And it's really weird. Garcetti was this district attorney who claimed he was overlooked for a promotion because he criticized a warrant issued by his superiors. Then the Supreme Court ruled that because his statements were made as a public employee rather than as a private citizen, his speech had no First Amendment protection. But the problem with that in my case is, why is my sharing of the Kyla Janae Lacey poem my viewpoint? That's a perspective my students can analyze and evaluate. We also talk about North Korea and Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il. That's definitely not my opinion. And even if I agree with Kyla, and I do, why does that forbid me from providing her experiences to my students? If they want teachers to remain completely neutral about an issue, then how could a teacher ever question a student about why they believe something? If I ask a student to consider a problem with their position or provide a counter to their argument or something, I lose the appearance of neutrality. What kind of learning environment does that create? Lawmakers who pass legislation like this, they use words like indoctrination. Teachers are indoctrinating students with the 1619 projects or the writings of Ta-Nehisi Coates. But I'd argue, isn't the absence of those perspectives also indoctrination? The classroom may be the only place where students like mine who live in all-white, evangelical, conservative environments have an opportunity to hear those perspectives. I think people misunderstand the purpose of a class like My Contemporary Issues. Look, I'm not trying to convince my students to believe one way or another. I want them to be able to understand that there are differing viewpoints and they deserve consideration too. We all have to live with one another, so let's do our best to try and understand each other.